Okay, Christine, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael, and welcome everyone. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight. As Michael mentioned, my name is Christine Svetkevich, and I'm DEQ's Northwest Region Administrator. This evening, we are hosting this public information meeting for several reasons. First, we know that the community is very interested in the facility. There has been a lot going on over the past many years, and we wanted to set up a forum where we could provide updates and answer questions. Second, we're in the public comment period for the draft air quality permit until December 16th. And we wanted to provide an additional opportunity for folks to ask us questions and learn more about how DEQ regulates Zenith before the upcoming hearings. And finally, while we will focus on the draft air quality permit during the upcoming hearings, those hearings have very specific process that do not allow for discussion of other topics, such as spill contingency planning, fuel tank seismic stability, or compliance, which we understand folks may want to hear about. Next slide, please. We have a presentation for you this evening to share information about the draft air quality permit. We will have time to take questions about the draft air quality permit and other ways DEQ regulates Zenith following the presentation. My DEQ colleagues here with me this evening who will help answer questions and facilitate the meeting include David Greiver, our air quality permit writer, Lisa Ball, one of our air quality managers, J.R. Giska, the program manager with the Cleaner Air Oregon program, Scott Smith, our spills contingency planner, Ian Johnson from our fuel tank seismic stability program, and he's an inspector, Becca Puskis, the interim manager of the Office of Compliance and Enforcement, Chris Varley, our air quality public affairs specialist, and Michael Locke, who you just met. Our ability to conduct an effective public meeting tonight depends on everyone's cooperation and commitment to engage respectfully. Please be courteous to everyone here tonight and allow one another the opportunity to ask questions. I want to recognize how much time it takes to learn about and follow these important issues, and I sincerely appreciate your involvement. I want to emphasize that your perspectives and questions are very important to us as we continue our work. This is not a formal public hearing, so we will not be accepting formal comments tonight. Please hold your comments for either the November 19th or December 4th hearings, or submit your comment in writing by December 16th. Verbal comments that are submitted at those hearings and written comments are evaluated equally. We really want to use this time together tonight to provide information and answer questions. Before we get to the Q&A portion of the meeting, I'd like to remind you that a list of questions from the April information meeting were compiled, and we answered them in writing. We're going to put a link to that document in the chat, and I actually think it's already there. And I encourage you to refer to that document as you formulate your questions. We would be happy to provide additional information or clarification for questions that we've already answered, but we also wanted to provide this opportunity to answer any new questions that come up. We're going to begin with the presentation on the draft air quality permit. If you have questions about the draft air quality permit or other ways DEQ regulates Zenith, please use the Q&A box to type your question, and we will read it aloud or use the raised hand feature, and we will recognize you following the presentation. All right, with that, let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to David Greiver, who's going to share information about the draft air quality permit.
Good evening, everyone. My name is David Greiver. I'm the air quality permit writer with DEQ's Northwest Region. Let's proceed. So to start with, the big question, what is an air contaminant discharge permit? It's a document or a contract that regulates stationary sources of emissions. And the emissions regulated include criteria pollutants. Those are particulate matter, various divisions of that, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, and VOC. Hazardous air pollutants, which are a list of 188 compounds designated by the US EPA, and toxic air contaminants, which are over 600 compounds specifically regulated under DEQ's Cleaner Air Oregon rules. Things that are outside of the scope of an air contaminant discharge permit include mobile sources such as trucks, trains, barges, location and land use of a project, specifically where someone is allowed to build something, and any type of off-site production or end use of products handled by the stationary source. So we'll move to the next slide. And this is an overhead view, satellite view of the Zenith facility located in the Lytton neighborhood in Northwest Portland. The red shape outlines the approximate boundary of the tank farm area of Zenith. So let's move to the next slide. So what do they do? As Michael had specified earlier, Zenith receives, stores, and ships liquid products. Receipt and shipping can handle via truck, rail, marine vessel, or pipeline. Products are stored in tanks, and the liquid products include things such as fossil fuels like crude oil, jet fuel, gasoline, conventional diesel, and renewable fuels and renewable products such as ethanol, renewable diesel, biodiesel, and renewable naphtha. So let's move to the next slide. And really, how did we get here? This is a very brief history. In May 2007, DEQ renewed Zenith's Title V permit. In August 2017, the source submitted a notice of intent to construct for marine loading of crude oil and an associated VOC control device. As part of the forthcoming renewal at that time of the Title V permit, DEQ did request an updated land use compatibility statement. In August 2021, the City of Portland provided a Lux disapproving the land use. That put a halt to the permit renewal process. But in October 2022, the City of Portland did provide an approved Lux, and one of those conditions associated in that Lux was applying for an air contaminant discharge permit. So that's where we get to here. So let's move to the next slide. And this is really some of the recent history. See, oh, here we go. Air quality permit application was received by DEQ in November of 2022. As mentioned, we did have a public information meeting April of this year. The public comment period began on October 10th. It was announced via DEQ public notice, and the draft air quality permit was published at that time. We have two public hearings coming up, November 19th and December 4th. And additional details regarding that are available in the public notice document, and I have something later on in this presentation with more details. The public comment period ends December 16th. Following the close of the public comment period, DEQ will review and respond to all comments received. And following that, DEQ will make a decision on the proposed permit. So moving to the next slide. To start, I'm going to go over some of the main emission units at the facility. With this picture, what I want to first draw your attention to are the two yellow arrows. Those are the two loading docks where product can be shipped and received from. On the left side of the screen is the Chevron dock, and then near the center, you've got the McCall dock. The blue area below is the tank farm area, and the black rectangles indicate the various truck and rail loading and unloading racks. Moving to the next slide, we're going to zoom in a little bit to the tank farm area. And what I want to show you here, the orange arrow is pointing to some of the combustion units on site, 2 boilers and a heater. And the red arrow is pointing to what's called the MVCU, or the vapor combustion unit. That is the control device used by Zenith to destroy emissions that are captured in the marine loading process. Moving to the next slide, there are a couple additional emission units. Zenith does have a pipeline for receipt and loading of products. There are also fugitive leaks associated with product conveyance. In this case, it's normally associated with piping. Anytime you have segments of pipe being connected, there is an opportunity for leaks to develop, and that's where these emissions can come from. These are not liquid spill leaks. These are gaseous leaks that may only be 600 ppm parts per million in the atmosphere. As I'd mentioned, there are the boilers and the heater for the combustion units, and Zenith does have 2 emergency engines, one for backup power and one for fire suppression. So moving to the next slide. We're going to talk a little about what air pollutants are generated from the various processes. The majority of emissions come from the organic liquid storage, loadout, and associated fugitive leaks. These are going to be volatile organic compounds and also some hazardous air pollutants. The combustion units, while smaller, do create quite a suite of different types of regulated pollutants, including particulate matter, the oxides of nitrogen, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, the VOCs, greenhouse gases, and hazardous air pollutants. So we move to the next slide. And yes, there are these pollutants, but there are various types of control strategies or devices used to reduce the quantity of emissions. For organic liquid storage and loadout, there are leak detection and repair procedures. These procedures, also known as LDAR, involve utilizing a device such as a flame ionization detector or photo ionization detector to determine the VOC concentrations at potential leak points. If leaks are discovered, they must be repaired within a certain time period. You also have floating roofs on some of the storage tanks. When in liquid form, the volatile organic compounds can volatilize from the liquid into the air. Floating roofs sit at or as close as possible to the liquid surface in order to reduce the amount of airspace available and thereby limiting the volatilization of those VOCs from the liquid to the air. And as I mentioned, there's the vapor combustion unit that is controlling emissions of VOC and hazardous air pollutants from the marine loadout activities. With fugitive emissions such as those from equipment and pipeline leaks, you're looking at the leak detection and repair and good management practices. And with your combustion units, you're looking for good combustion practices such as proper air to fuel ratios and following the applicable requirements set by the manufacturer and in the permit. So moving on, we talk about what the emissions are, how we control them, but how are they calculated? I know many people want to know what are the specific methods. One thing you will notice is AP42 shows up quite a bit in this list. AP42 is EPA's compendium of emission factors, and it's based on all available data that they have, which can include modeling data, performance test data, or lab bench scale data. For calculating emissions from the storage tanks, we use the updated algorithms from AP42, which have been updated approximately 4 years ago, I believe, because some of the previous EPA software that did calculated emissions did not have these updates. So the old out-of-date software has not been used for this. And it also takes into account physical properties of the liquid being stored. And that's important because some liquids have a high vapor pressure and will volatilize easily, resulting in a higher emission rate, while other compounds such as conventional diesel or renewable diesel have very low vapor pressures and tend not to volatilize significantly. With product loading, again, we use the physical properties, and then there is an equation for calculating the emissions from loading activities in AP42. For fugitive leaks, EPA has a full guide, the EPA protocol for equipment leak estimates. With the boilers and heaters, we used AP42. DEQ also has specific emission factors for particulate matter and sulfur dioxide based on DEQ tests that have occurred in the state. The engines utilize AP42 and the emission limits that they are subject to under the federal regulation for engines, New Source Performance Standard Subpart 4I. And for the vapor combustion unit, we do have one stack test that was performed on this specific unit in 2020, and that was utilized along with DEQ emission factors and manufacturer specifications. So let's move to the next slide. And yes, there are going to be changes in emissions. The main things to be aware of are the plant side emission limits are being changed and being revised. Most significantly, volatile organic compounds are being reduced to 39 tons per year, and that is the maximum amount that they are allowed to emit under their permit. In addition, the previous Title V permit utilized what we called generic plant side emission limits, which were large values just below an applicable significant emission rate. The use of generic plant side emission limits is not commonplace anymore. And instead, we have site-specific limits that are going to be based, they actually are based on the potential to emit from the facility. 2 additional pollutants have also been included in the analysis compared to the 2007 permit: fine particulate matter and greenhouse gases, as neither were regulated pollutants when the Title V permit was issued in 2007. There are also several updates to the emission calculations. Most importantly, the updated algorithm for tank emissions. We now have source test data, site-specific data for the vapor combustion unit. Zenith is handling a different suite of materials. With different materials, you have different physical properties, including the vapor pressure, which will affect emissions. And with fugitive leaks, in 2007, Zenith was operating an asphalt refinery, and the fugitive leaks for the facility were calculated based on leaks from a refinery. Zenith is now operating as more of a marketing terminal, and the marketing terminal emission factors are used for equipment leaks. So what are the specific numbers? We'll move to the next slide. We'll have an overview. There's a lot going on here, but really what I want to focus on here is that the carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, and VOCs, volatile organic compounds, all have reduced plant side emission limits. Carbon monoxide's moving from 99 to 24, oxides of nitrogen 77 to 26, and volatile organic compounds from 179 tons per year to 39 tons per year. Greenhouse gases are a new plant side emission limit based on the potential to emit of the facility, which is 29,800 tons per year. And plant side emission limits were removed for particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide. These pollutants have a potential to emit below DEQ de minimis levels, which is 1 ton per year for each of those pollutants, and no PSCL is required, or no plant side emission limit is required if the potential to emit or the maximum amount the facility can emit is below that level. So let's move to the next slide. We're still talking about changes. What are the changes going on in the air quality permit? Well, first, there's new equipment. The vapor combustion unit is now included as an emission unit and has requirements that need to be followed. There are additional loading activities, specifically the marine loading, which wasn't part of the facility in 2007. And emergency engines are now included. There have been multiple changes in regulations in the state of Oregon. Some specific ones include in 2015, particulate matter and opacity limits were completely revised. And in 2022, there was a rule change in November of 2022, and we no longer utilize the generic plant side emission limits. Everything is going to be site specific based on potential to emit. And Both fine particulate matter and greenhouse gases are now included as regulated air pollutants. There have been some regulation changes on the federal level as well. There are now rules specific to engines, the new source performance standard subpart 4I, and the National Emission Standard for Hazardous Air Pollutants, subpart 4Z. There's also a rule for gasoline distribution that Zenith is subject to. That's under NESHAP subpart 6B. Let's move to the next slide. So what exactly changed in the permit? What content is there that's different? As I'd mentioned before, the plant site emission limits have changed significantly. The asphalt refinery emission units have been removed from the permit. As part of the LUX, the air contaminant discharge permit is to include only the terminal operations. And once the LUX stated that once the air contaminant discharge permit is fully approved, that Zenith must then request termination of their Title V permit and no longer be able to use the asphalt refinery. Their updated storage tank requirements based on federal rule changes, engine requirements, and again, the vapor combustion unit, it's included in the permit. There are source testing requirements and there are operational and monitoring requirements to ensure that it's properly operated at a level at least on par with what was observed during the source testing event. And there are a couple of requirements that were included as part of the LUX that are incorporated into the air contaminant discharge permit. So moving on, many people may ask, what about Clean Air Oregon? Clean Air Oregon is DEQ's industrial air toxics permitting program that requires a source to perform a risk assessment based on their air toxic emissions. For purpose of CAO, Zenith is an existing source because it commenced construction before November 16, 2018, and it had submitted all necessary applications prior to that date. DEQ established a prioritization for call-in for existing sources to perform risk assessments. So there are currently about 360 permitted sources that need to go through this program. There are 3 prioritization groups, 1, 2, and 3. 1 and 2 each have 20 sources, and the remainder all being in group 3. DEQ has completed calling in all of the group 1 sources, is currently working through group 2. Zenith is in group 3 based on the amount and toxicity of the emissions from the facility, as well as the location of the facility in an industrial zoned area away from homes and schools. Zenith will be called in sometime after the completion of group 2 sources, which should be completed in late 2025. So it means Zenith may not be called in until sometime in 2026 or later. However, the call-in date for the program can vary. A lot depends on staffing and resource logistics and any additional information on their emissions that show that they are more or less toxic than previously thought. If you do have follow-up questions, please reach out to the CAO program directly. There is an email address here on the screen, but we will make sure to include it in the chat as well. So what's next? Well, we've got the information meeting today with question and answer session. November 19th, we have a public hearing at the University of Portland Buckley Center Auditorium. This is from 7 to 9 p.m. It is in person, but we are providing a virtual option. In-person attendees will be invited to provide comment first, with any online or phone attendees following. We will have an additional public hearing December 4th from 6 to 8 p.m., which is virtual. And December 16th, the public comment period ends at 5 p.m. As stated before, DEQ will and does review and respond to all comments prior to making a final decision. So with that, we will open the floor for questions. And yes, it looks like we did get the Clean Air Oregon email address put into the chat.
Thank you, David, for that presentation. We're now going to begin the questions and answers portion of the meeting, and we're going to take questions up until 8 p.m. So we've got a good nearly 90 minutes for Q&A if we have enough questions for that, but we're happy to be here to answer your questions. So I'm going to ask folks to remember to use the Q&A box to type your question, and we're going to read that aloud, or you can use the raise hand feature, and I will recognize you to speak. If you're on the phone, please remember to press *9 to raise your hand, and then press *6 when you're prompted to unmute yourself. Now, we anticipate that many of you are going to have questions. So even if you immediately raise your hand or you put your question in the Q&A box, we're going to get to your question in the order that we see on your screen, but we are committed to getting through your questions. So what I want to do is we're going to kind of bounce between live questions from folks that are raising their hands and folks that wrote questions in the chat. And I saw that there were some questions that came up through the presentation. So Chris, Chris Varley on our team, he's going to help me with reading out questions that were typed in the Q&A box. And Chris, would you be able to read out our first question?
Sure. How's the sound? Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. First question. In the frequently asked questions document, DEQ mentions that it will perform on-site inspections to ensure that Zenith is complying with all applicable permit requirements. What do these on-site inspections entail?
Yep, so the on-site inspections, in most cases, DEQ will arrive at the facility. In some cases, these can be announced. In other cases, they are unannounced. We come with the copy of the permit, so we will walk around site with the facility operators to view all the various emission units, take a look at everything, see if there's anything in conflict between the permit and what we see on the ground. And then it also includes a records review. So we will review records on site, see what they have, and again, ensure that the records that they have kept match what is being reported to us. And in some cases, like in June, we had a joint inspection with EPA where we were able to utilize EPA's FLIR camera and actually try and view VOC emissions with some of the technology that they have. So that's a condensed version of what you would see at a normal compliance evaluation or on-site inspection.
Great, thank you, David. Now I'm going to call on the first hand that's raised on my screen, and that is Nancy Heiser. Nancy, thank you for being with us, and you are welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much. I want to refer to the calculating emissions screen that you showed us, David, in which AP42 came up in 4 different categories. We are well aware in Linton that AP42 was developed by EPA with significant industry input a number of years ago. Last year or the year before, EPA came out and said AP42 should no longer be used. And we understand that DEQ does not have alternative ways to measure, so it is still being used unless something has happened between a year and a half, 2 years ago, and now. Has AP42 been upgraded? It was proved to underestimate emissions by a huge percentage. Thank you.
Yep, yeah, there was an enforcement alert regarding AP42 emission calculations, and I believe that was specific to heated tanks that store asphalt. There was some underestimating occurring in those specific tanks. Now, AP42 as a whole, it's still relied upon with EPA. However, anytime you do have site-specific data, it's always best to use that. But at this point in time, for storage tank emissions, AP42 is the best estimating tool that is available.
Okay. Thank you, David. Chris, do you mind reading us our next question in the Q&A box?
Sure. Let me just add, the first question came from Linda Liu. Thank you, Linda, for your question. This one's from Theodora Tsongas. I hope I said that right. How does DEQ integrate scientific understanding of climate disruption by combustion processes into its evaluation of permit applications for non-combustion fuel processes and facilities?
Yeah, so with greenhouse gas emissions, the current system that we have for permitting, really the only, aside from Division 215, which is our greenhouse gas reporting rule, any type of evaluation of greenhouse gas control doesn't come into play unless you have a major facility or a facility going through a major process under new source review, which doesn't occur until you start hitting 100 ton per year potential to emit, or 250 tons per year potential to emit, depending on your type of facility. So for a minor source, greenhouse gases are included with regards to a plant site emission limit, but there's no specific type of control strategy or control analysis that is required for facilities that are a minor source of emissions at this point in time.
All right. Thank you, David. I'm going to call on our next person who has their hand raised, and that is also Linda Liu. So I'm about to ask you to unmute yourself. You should be able to do that now, and feel free to ask your question. Thank you for being here.
Oh, hi. Hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
So following upon Theodore's question, well, if Zenith does have the plan to transition to new renewables later on, and is, giving us that business plan, which we appreciate for the clarity, it is still, after all, a fossil fuel facility. I would like to know, why is the DEQ considering permitting on an expansion of operations of a fossil fuel facility rather than protecting the public and ensuring Oregon's state climate progress? For context, in the permit drafted, 29,800 tons of greenhouse gases per year using the EPA tool are equivalent to the emission of more than 7,000 cars driven for a whole year. So between now, 2025 to 2027, that's emissions of roughly around 14,000 cars. And then Oregon has a pledge of at least 45% carbon dioxide reduction below the 1990 levels by 2030. So that's 3 years after the proposed transition to renewables drafted by Zenith. And I would just like to understand the extent to which DEQ has factored this into, tracking Oregon's progress as part of a state agency in allowing a further addition to our statewide emission. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay. Yes, so with regards to greenhouse gas emissions and air contaminant discharge permitting, we are held to whatever the applicable permitting system in place is. And at this point in time, we do not have a program that says at a certain level, you must do any type of greenhouse gas reductions. The only time that could be involved is if you're looking at new source review, as I mentioned, for previous facilities. And again, this 29,800, we're looking at the potential maximum. And that's if all of these combustion units are operating 24/7. So actual emissions should be significantly less, depending on the operational levels at the facility. Now, from a greenhouse gas reduction standpoint, I know DEQ is looking at reintroducing the the CPP, the Clean Power Plan, but I do not have specific details about that. I'm sure that if you do have some questions on that, we can get you some links as to what the current status of that program is.
Can I ask a follow-up to what you just said? I think I didn't quite understand.
The Clean Power Plan, DEQ did
No,
propose.
not to that, sorry, David. It's to the ways how you described the 29,800 tons is their maximum. So can you walk me through a little bit in terms of how Zenith has planned to comply with that quota and what are their procedures and how robust that measurement is, since there is an actual number on the proposed maximum?
Yep, so these were all calculated based on the fuels combusted. So in this case, we're looking at natural gas for the boilers and heaters. And then with the vapor combustion unit, there is some assist natural gas along with the type of fuel vapors being combusted that are captured from the loading process. So all of those go back to 40 CFR 98, which has various averages and emission factors for different types of fuels and what quantity of greenhouse gases are released when a specific amount of it is combusted.
Okay, great. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. I will look into that more. And just want to give your confirmation that the DEQ is well aware of the outcome of this permit, which will, in a way, inhibit Oregon's climate goal. Is that correct?
I am not able to specifically answer that question. That may be more something that's geared towards our regional administrator.
Thanks, David. And Linda, I just want to acknowledge that DEQ has reviewed all of the information, and we acknowledge everything that has been shared in the draft permit and the permit evaluation report as being the information that DEQ has to make our decision. Thank you.
No, absolutely. I think I'm just doing something as an informed citizen would do, that things are all connected, just like you breathe the same air that we breathe in the blast zone. Thank you. Thank you for the time.
Thanks, Linda. Appreciate your questions. All right. Next question, Chris, can you read what we have in our Q&A box?
Our next question is from Patricia Kullberg. According to your current FAQs, periodic source testing, which tests air emissions at the source, is performed by an independent third-party company. That's in quotations from our facts. My understanding is that the independent company is selected, hired, paid, and supervised by Zenith. At least that was the arrangement for the Covanta incinerator. How can that be considered independent? Why doesn't DEQ choose, hire, and supervise the testing company and make Zenith pay for the service?
Yep, so testing is done by a third party. And again, it is selected by the source that happens to be required to do the testing. However, DEQ is required to receive a test plan prior to any tests. We have a source test coordinator who reviews the test plan, determines if there are any errors or any modifications that need to be incorporated into it, then sends comments back and requires an updated test plan prior to approving it. DEQ source test coordinators are invited, and actually it's preferred that they're on site during testing, because there are some times where the source test coordinator will notice that something is going wrong, or there's an issue with the specific test method that needs to be revised on the fly. And then once the test report is submitted to DEQ, again, the source test coordinators review the report, and if there are any errors, they require a revised report. So Yes, Zenith gets to choose the contractor, Zenith pays the contractor, Zenith can supervise them, but DEQ is also looking over to ensure that everything is done according to the appropriate method.
All right. Thank you, David. And I got something in the chat that that maybe my sound is a little silent. So I'm going to try to speak louder for folks. And if there continues to be audio issues from me, please let us know in the chat, and I will try to address that. But now I'm going to call on our next person with their hand raised. Joe, Joe. Oh, that was for Chris. Sorry about that. Well, either way, we're going to keep letting us know, giving us feedback if there's audio issues. We appreciate that. I'm going to call on our next person with their hand raised. That's going to be Joe Stenger. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name, but Joe, you are welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you. What assessments have been made to the above ground storage tanks, particularly the tanks from the 1940s that are way past their lifespan, to ensure that they're really safe to store highly volatile products like quote unquote renewable naphtha?
Thanks, Joe. Were you asking that in terms of in safety as in like when it comes to, let's say in the case of an earthquake, or what, can you explain a little bit more what you mean by that?
Well, all aspects of safety, obviously, but older tanks have the potential for more leaks, and the question is, has that been tested in regards to products like renewable naphtha, which is something that will be new on site.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, I think Scott from our spill contingency team, he would be able to help you out with that question.
Yeah, I'll take a swing at this. It's actually, this is a good question for the EPA because they have the SPCC program that oversees tank construction, the inspection schedule, and all of those things. So what that entails is there's specific industry construction standards, and usually for tanks like this, it's API 653, and they're on a certain timeline that they have to do different types of inspections. Some of them are just external inspections, and some of them they have to drain the tank and take all the equipment apart and so forth. So for a tank that is built in the 1940s, that would have been done many times, and sections of the tank may have been rebuilt. So they are up to the latest standards, and I know that the seismic fuels stability program is there to make sure that they're compliant with earthquake codes as well. And Ian can talk about that if that didn't answer your question.
Sure. I mean, anything you can say more about seismic safety would be very helpful, because this is a huge concern for a lot of the people in the population.
Sure. So I'd like to just go ahead and start off by saying that sometimes people have a misunderstanding that a lot of these fuel tanks are just sitting there, like agreed, from the majority of them were built around 1950 to 1954. And we tend to get this idea that they're just dilapidated and old. Definitely old, but however, standards actually have to be maintained to where they actually checked for corrosion resistance and just steel thickness to make sure that they're even serviceable. So they are a bit safer. However, when we enter the realm in seismic stability, we understand that there is a gap for a seismic code in regards to these tanks, and therefore that's what the program is addressing. So over the next 10 years, these facilities, through their assessments, will say, well, some of these tanks are probably just going to have to be completely refabbed or completely, drawn down, and we'll have a new one in its place to meet the code, But that's actually for the structural engineers to determine according to their risk mitigation implementation plan. Did that answer your question, sir? Or?
Yep, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, Ian. And I have a follow-up question. One came through the chat about it's kind of on this topic with their seismic vulnerability assessment, about asking about just the number of tanks that they reported on. The question mentions that they reported 4, while also claiming that they should report on all of their tanks. Can you maybe shed a little bit more light on their vulnerability assessment? And,
I could, yes.
the-
So I would say this, that this is a new process for any facility to do anywhere in the continental US. This is really brand new. So ultimately, DEQ kind of has to act as a shepherd in a way to kind of hold their hands through and show them the proper route of compliance, because a lot of people could become, all shoulders. And that's why we put out checklists to make sure that industry had kind of guide rails of these standards that we're looking for, as well as the engineers that they employ. I think that the overall, you're going to see within a 10-year timeline, a lot of those tanks that will be deemed unserviceable or ineffective for the seismic standard that we put forth are going to have to just be brought down or engineered to where they are hardened to a risk category 4 level. And just so I can give the audience a little bit of context, risk category 4 is usually reserved for nuclear facilities and military bases. Okay, so we are trying to take this to the highest level to where we can harden these facilities up with this vulnerability. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Joe, for your question. Chris, can you take us to our next question in the Q&A box, please?
Yes. The next question is from Kathy Spofford. In the FAQ document, DEQ mentions that renewable naphtha contains lower quantities of hazardous air pollutants and hydrogen sulfide. Can you share the sources or studies for these? And please correct me on the pronunciation there, David, if I missed it.
Yeah. So with regards to the the contents of these various liquids, the safety data sheet for renewable naphtha was included as part of the air permit application, and that is available. The full application is available online. And in addition, because the crude oil is a mixture of multiple things, that's why it can have these multiple types of hazardous air pollutants, and the sulfur in it is what results in the hydrogen sulfide emissions. Whereas with renewable naphtha, you are getting really a pure stream, because it's produced in a process as opposed to being drilled, and just taken from wherever it happened to be in the ground. And again, all the data that we used for that has been included in the application.
Thanks, David. I'm going to call on our next raised hand. I've got Lynn Handlin. You are now welcome to unmute yourself and please ask your question. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a few directly related questions, all about the McCall dock issue. First of all, why is DEQ downplaying Zenith's illegal expansion of fossil fuel facility after the illegally added infrastructure to connect to the McCall dock? And they did that to increase their fossil fuel operation. So why has that not been dealt with? Why did it take DEQ over 2.5 years to discover that they had expanded and were using the additional dock? And what is the consequence to Zenith for this illegal use of the McCall dock for 2.5 years?
Thanks, Lynn. I think Becca, if you wanted to chime in a little bit on this, and then maybe David as well.
Yeah, I could chime in a little. And this was discovered as part of the permit development process. I had come new to this project in mid-2023. So when I was reviewing everything, looking at the previous permit, I noticed there were some indiscrepancies. And unfortunately, that's why it took time to realize that there was a difference and that there was a construction activity that had occurred without providing the proper notification. Now, with regards to DEQ's enforcement response and anything that stems from that, I do need to turn it over to Becca because she's with the Office of Compliance and Enforcement.
Yeah, sorry about that. It took me a minute to find my unmute button. Yeah, I think that's the correct answer. From an emissions perspective, the use of the McCall dock only required the submittal of a NC or a notice of construction. And so the way that violation is categorized in our enforcement guidance, like the type of response it receives, is a warning letter. And so we try to, when we do enforcement, we try to treat similar violations in a similar manner. And so we look to that enforcement guidance, and the warning letter was the response. So we said, we understand now that you made that change in that facility, which was to connect some existing piping so that the McCall dock could be used. And then the enforcement response was a warning letter with a request to submit that notice of construction.
So no consequence. So there was no actual consequence to Zenith for doing illegal things. Over the years, they have done many, many illegal things, violated regulation. Have there ever been any significant consequences to Zenith? We've only heard allusions to there were consequences, but nowhere could I find what those consequences were.
Yeah, I think, Lynn, what I'd refer you to, I believe that there's a summary of all the enforcement that DEQ has taken regarding Zenith in the permit review report. And the way we view our enforcement response is based on the severity of the violation from an environmental perspective. And in this case, it would be an air emissions perspective. And so I guess I'd refer you to the specifics in the permit review report for any enforcement the DEQ has taken. I don't know, David, if you have a page number for that.
Sure. So it didn't cost them any money. Nothing happened. They were just told, "Oh, we saw that you did something." They said, "Oh, okay," and that's it, right? No consequence.
Our response was a warning letter with a request to submit a notice to construction.
Right. So no consequence. Thank you.
I would also add that that is the process that goes for pretty much any source, whether that was Zenith or another source that did the same thing, it would follow the same process. And
in the case of Zenith, there have been so many violations that at some point you would think something would happen, and it doesn't seem like much. So I guess it's not an additive thing. It's just each violation is whatever. Thank you.
Yeah, well, in this case, we're following the same process as we do for any source. And I do know that Zenith did submit that form that we requested in that warning letter to correct. And I would also refer you, as Becca just mentioned, to go to the review report and see the list of violations that have happened. And if your question was referring also to anything about the Lux with the city of Portland, those questions are best sent over to the city of Portland, since we don't have we don't do land use decisions. But thank you for your questions, and thank you, Becca, as well.
Yeah, no, Lynn, I would just follow up and say, I think the point about consistency is really important. So notice to construct is for a change at the facility that has a smaller amount of emissions, and then changes that have a bigger increase in emissions require different types of authorizations, or they might trigger other regulations, like new source review, for example. And so those would get a bigger enforcement response. And it's really important that we're consistent in the way we treat one notice to construct violation at one facility versus another. Part of our enforcement guidance is looking at the enforcement history of a source, and we did that in calibrating our enforcement response here. So
Thanks, Becca. And I'm going to throw in the chat here where you could find that section of the review report. But yes, thank you. I appreciate it.
Cool. So DEQ does nothing. Great.
Thank you for your question. All right, Chris, do you mind reading our next question in the chat?
Our next question is from Ember. Can Zenith ask for a permit modification in the future for a higher allowable emissions limit within the ACDP permit? We've seen this happen with the Carty 2 power plant when the company came back after getting approved, saying they had the wrong algorithm.
So in this specific situation, Zenith can ask, but the LUX, the land use compatibility statement, does say that they have to have an air contaminant discharge permit with a VOC limit of 39 tons per year. So if they wanted to increase that, it would have to be an updated LUX of some kind. That's something they'd have to work out with the city. Now, if a source, we're not going to be looking at Zenith, but if a source has 39 ton per year of VOC and they want to increase above 40 tons per year, they're going to be looking at a significant modification and potential state new source review, which could involve modeling and it could involve best available control technologies. So going above that significant emission level or significant emission rate of 40 tons per year does entail a much more robust permitting activity that may include control technology analysis.
Okay, thanks, David. Next up, I have Kate Murphy. You are welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you. I will try to stick to just one question for now. So over the years, DEQ has identified roughly 20 different violations for Zenith, illustrating a history of non-compliance, basically since Zenith began operating in Portland. The violations range in severity, but there's very little evidence of any consequence for these violations. Can you explain how this is not creating incentives for industry to violate regulations? And at what point will DEQ step in? At what number of violations or frequency will DEQ step in to protect the public from a company with such blatant disregard for regulations? Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. I think since we're talking about the enforcement process and enforcement guidance, I'm going to invite Becca to answer your question.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I can talk in generalities because it's a question that's posed as a general question. We try to treat, we look at the environmental impact of the violation, and in this case, most of the violations that we've seen relate to changes or notifications at the facility. And we have a guidance tool, which is an internal policy that we use to determine our enforcement response and try to make sure that it's appropriate and also consistent across the state. And so we do ratchet up enforcement if something is repeated or if it has a really significant environmental impact. So I think that's kind of the best general answer that I can give you. We would, warning letter is a lower level of response. And if we have a more severe violation or a repeated violation, we would ratchet up to a penalty or an order to comply. So I guess that's my general answer. I think if you have questions about specific violations and the specific enforcement response, we could perhaps get into that or provide an answer later.
I guess, thank you for that. And I guess I'm thinking more broadly about, in terms of Zenith, there's a history of consistent non-compliance. And some of those violations were things like storing highly volatile fuels in the wrong tanks, which creates, additional threats to public health and safety. some of them were failing to notify DEQ of what they were doing. I think most concerning is the McCall dock expansion. I think there's a big difference in how the public interprets that and how DEQ seems to be framing that as a change to the facility. From my perspective, I'm seeing them expanding their fossil fuel facility to include an additional dock that wasn't part of their use before. And, you know, it was understood that, you know, the city permits that were obtained, the land use compatibility statement and the greenway review for the 3 pipes under Front Avenue had language saying that the new infrastructure would be used exclusively for renewables and non-fossil fuels. And when Zenith hooked up to the McCall dock illegally, it started handling fossil fuels at that dock while simultaneously applying for those permits. And so I guess the question is both about the extent of noncompliance, and also why are we calling that a change to the facility when they've actually expanded their facility, added a new dock, and increased their ability to transport via marine vessel? Thank you.
That's a lot packed in there. I guess trying to think where to start. It just in response to the facts on the McCall dock, my understanding is that connection was made prior to the Lux. And so the condition that requires renewable fuels came later. So that's something that we need to look at in permitting. And then just in terms of the enforcement response and repeated violations, that is something we do look at. And again, it's like which types of violations have been repeated. And we do consider that. So for example, with an asbestos abatement contractor, if they repeatedly have bad projects where they're violating work practices, we might put them on a management plan, and then as a next step, look at the revocation of their asbestos license. And so I think, you know, similar in a, you know, facility that has a lot of permit violations, we would look at, okay, do we need more inspections, or do we need some kind of compliance plan, or do we need them to do an environmental audit? We would look at like what other tools can we use to help ensure compliance. But we do, you know, big picture look at multiple violations. And I think what we have here is, according to our guidance, what we would consider multiple lower level violations. They haven't triggered like big regulatory thresholds or anything like that.
Thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to answer that. I think it does make sense that broader picture for all of these air permits that DEQ would have some sort of metric to have a quantity after a certain number of violations or something like that. Like many state regulated programs, then the permit gets revoked until you can show that you can operate within compliance or something. Anyway, thank you for your time.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I mean, just for a little bit of context, I think with some of these larger facilities, especially Title V facilities like mills or landfills or things, there's just so many emission units and so much reporting. And we do have other cases where we find kind of multiple smaller violations, and we do address them according to our enforcement guidance and kind of look up at that buildup over time. But I just, in my own personal experience, this volume of kind of smaller violations is not striking. And that's just my own personal take on it. But it's something that we do keep track of and review each time we see a new violation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Becca. Chris, do you mind reading our next question in the chat?
Yes. Our next question comes from Pat Kaczmarek. Pat K. Hope I said that right. Why was Zenith allowed to use the air quality permit that was issued for the previous operator, an asphalt company? Why was this transfer of ownership allowed while there was a moratorium in place on a new fossil fuel operation?
Yep. So the group of all the emission units that encompass the asphalt refinery and the terminal operations. Those were all emission units operated by a company at one point in time. DEQ's rules do allow the sale of a company, and this facility has had multiple changes of ownership in the past 20 years, with Zenith coming on and becoming the named permittee in 2018. So again, many of these processes have been going on. Really what's just changed is the material that happens to be handled, be it asphalt, diesel, or crude.
Thanks, David. I'm going to move to our next raised hand. Got Dineen Crow. You are welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. So it appears that a primary reason for justifying this permit is a reduction of hypothetical potential harm. But at the same time, the actual real world harm is increasing, which kind of feels like, you know, saying to a bank robber who could have robbed 100 banks to go ahead and just be allowed to rob 5 instead, and that's fine. So I'm just like wondering, does your agency have an obligation to use your authority to actually reduce harm rather than the status quo of permitting it? You know, for example, knowing that when we're talking about renewable fuels going through these trains, they are also explosive when traveling on rail. And how is that harm being mitigated, just for example?
Yeah, the main thing that we're looking at when we are proposing and issuing an air contaminant discharge permit is whether the proposed facility can comply with all applicable and legal requirements that would be in the permit. So in this case, yeah, the potential harm, as you say, we're looking at reducing the maximum allowable emissions from the facility. So we are looking at reduced emissions. And then the next step, again, is looking at whether or not the source will and can comply with all of the applicable requirements.
Thanks for that, David. And I'll just add a couple more things is that for folks, if you're interested, when DEQ receives an application for doing anything that we regulate from any individual or company or business in Oregon, we have an obligation to process that application. And so that's part of the reason why we are here tonight, because we have an obligation. We received an application, a renewal application, and we are going through the permit process as it relates to the regulations that we have available to us. And one additional thing that I'll say, and feel free, anyone on the DEQ team, to jump in if I missed something as it relates to this question, but when we are renewing a specific permit, in this case, the air permit, we can only use the air quality regulations that exist today to make our decision. And even though we regulate this facility and many facilities and other programs, we have to look at the regulations for each program at the time we are either renewing their permit or we're reviewing a plan that was received or whatever it is that the program requires. And we can't consider things that are outside of the authority of each of the media programs when we're making a decision for that. So moving back to Zenith, we regulate them from lots of different perspectives and lots of different programs. But in this air quality permit, draft permit that is out for public comment, we only can accept comments and make decisions on the actual draft permit based on our regulations. not on other programs that we have or don't have for that matter.
Okay, thank you, Diane, for your question, and thank you, David and Christine. Okay, so we're going to move to our next Q&A or question in the Q&A box. So Chris, feel free to take it away.
Thank you. This one comes from Lori King. Why did DEQ allow Zenith to report emissions for roughly 4 years for the marine vapor combustion unit without Zenith ever performing the required initial source test?
Yep, so the vapor combustion unit was installed via a notice of intent to construct, type 1, I believe, at the time. And it was default approved within, I believe, 10 days after submittal. And DEQ did intend and included performance test requirements when the Title V permit was up for renewal. However, then DEQ did receive the disapproved land use compatibility statement from the city, and the Title V renewal then became in jeopardy. So following some time, DEQ decided, look, we just can't wait until the permit's renewed or we figure out what exactly is going to happen with the facility. So we did require performance tests at that point in time. And it happened in 2022 when the test was fully conducted.
Thanks, David. Okay, moving to our next raised hand. This will be Eileen Fromer. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question. Thanks.
Thank you. In both of the Lux agreements with the city, Zenith agreed to a definition of renewable fuels as, quote, renewable fuels such as biodiesel, biomethane, and clean hydrogen are produced from non-petroleum, non-natural gas renewable resources and have less than 5% fossil fuel content. Why is that, unquote, why is that definition not included as a condition in the draft ACDP?
We don't have the definition verbatim as you had mentioned it. However, we do have a condition regarding the new components that can only be used for renewable fuels and non-fuel products. And we do have a reference to the Portland City Code citation that was used in the land use compatibility statement, where it said Zenith must not provide any new connections unless they are for renewable products and non-fuel products as defined in PCC, and then it provided a citation in the land use compatibility statement.
So would that mean that they would have to have less than 5% of fossil fuel content?
That would mean that the specific renewable fuel being transferred must have less than 5% fossil fuel content.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, David. Yeah, so next up, let's see. Yeah, let's go back to the Q&A box. Sorry, kind of got myself lost here in all my windows. Chris, feel free to ask our next question.
Next question is from Ember. How is DEQ reconciling the significant discrepancies between the land use agreement with the city and the draft air permit?
So I think we will need some additional context about what some of the significant discrepancies are, but I can tell you there are differences because the two documents are doing two different things and have two different legal authorities. So while the Lux or land use compatibility statement, it's written by the city, enforced by the city, an air contaminant discharge permit really needs to focus only on air-related issues. Otherwise, if you start incorporating a land use requirement coupled with a solid waste requirement, you have a monster permit that becomes difficult to enforce and difficult to have the proper entities regulating each condition. So again, the focus on the air contaminant permit is what does DEQ have authority over and what do our rules allow for?
All right. Thanks, David. Next up, I have Nikki Mandel. You are welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Thank you very much. I have a, excuse me, I have a two-part question. In the presentation tonight, you said that there could be a time between when there's organic liquid leak detection and repair. And I'm kind of curious about how much time that might be. And the second part question has to do not with a leak specifically, but it's related in this way. How will DEQ hold Zenith accountable if they increase emissions above the permit level? And again, it may be that you don't detect it for a while, but how would you hold them accountable in that case, as well as in the case of a leak detection and the need for repair? I'd like a specific answer here, not just some generic thing. I'd like a very specific answer about how you will hold them accountable and over how much time.
Yeah, so with leak detection and repair, I need to double check the current permit to give you that exact answer, but I do know that in many other similar regulations for leak detection and repair, there's a 15-day window between when a leak is detected and when it must be repaired. However, there are some caveats for certain types of leaks that are either in a dangerous area to get to where you need a plant shutdown, or potentially where the components can't be accessed for some reason. Now, how would Zenith be held accountable? In this case, we're looking at a source with 39 ton per year VOC limit. If we determine or discover that actual emissions have exceeded 39 tons per year, we're looking at a plant site emission limit violation, which has a very specific response in DEQ's enforcement guidance. In addition, we're also looking at a potential new source review violation where a source should have obtained a either type A or type B state new source review permit. And that's one of those that may require an additional control technology and modeling analysis. So it's essentially operating as if you had a higher permit than you were permitted at. So it's definitely a higher priority violation that gets investigated by Office of Compliance and Enforcement.
If I could follow up, given the conversation already about the hookup to McCall's dock, if they went ahead and did that and they needed the type A or the type B permit, what would be happening in the time between the discovery of the emissions exceeding the 39 and when they submit the permit and you go through all your permitting reviews, et cetera?
Yeah, that's something I think we'd need Becca to chime in on.
We're talking about like a hypothetical of if there was a plant site emission limit violation, what would we do?
Yeah, sorry, Nikki, did you want to rephrase that? I'm sorry to.
I just want to make sure I understand the question.
Yes, because what he said was that if there was this kind of plant site violation, it could be that there's a new source and they would need a type A or a type B permit. And I'm thinking about how you answered the question about the McCall dock hookup. And you said, oh, they just needed to file paperwork to say that they were doing this new thing. So I'm wondering, like, would this be handled like they exceed the permit emissions? And now you say, oh, all you need to do is file a new permit. What happens to them? I mean, would you actually allow them to do that and kind of let them keep operating with these expanded, excessive, out of permit emissions while they go through a new permitting process?
So exceeding a plant site emission limit is considered a more significant violation, no matter who does it. And we have a more significant enforcement response. So they would receive a penalty, and in order to comply, so we would look at if they haven't already taken action to get back into compliance with their limit, we would look at what is needed to do that and order them to take the action that we thought was needed. And then they would receive a penalty that one a piece of the penalty is we look at the economic benefit they gained from that violation. So those are kind of, if that hypothetical situation occurred, that's how we would look at any source that exceeded a plant site emission limit. It's considered, something more significant, so it gets a more significant enforcement response.
And
Thank
then
you.
I'll add
Thank you.
into Becca with potentially operating as a major modification or a major new source review source that also increases the severity of the violation as opposed to just exceeding a PSEL.
Right. Sometimes by the amount of emissions, they've triggered another regulatory threshold. And so those types of things also trigger a bigger enforcement response.
Thank you.
And real quick, before we move to the next question, Becca, when it comes to these types of violations, I know it's dependent on what it is and how severe any repeats, but can you talk about a little bit about how penalties are assessed?
Yes, we have a statutory authority and rule authority, and our penalty authority is based on a formula. And so that same formula has a lot of details about the type of the violation and the number of occurrences, the mental state. There's a bunch of factors that go in, and we write up our penalty assessment, and then they have a right to they have an appeal right, a right to a contested case on whether we got it right according to our formula. But as I mentioned, an important piece of that is the economic benefit. So we try to calculate if they received a benefit from that violation, like is there something they should have been doing to stay in compliance? And if that is new equipment or pollution controls, we try to estimate the cost of that, and that becomes part of their penalty. Is that what you were asking about, Michael?
Yes, somebody we got a question in the chat here just
Okay.
asking about the amount of the penalty and just wanted to get a little more clarification on how those penalties are assessed and what the methodology was.
Yeah, no, we have statutes and rules on that. And again, the purpose is try to be consistent. But it's also based on the factors of the specific situation.
Great. Thanks, Becca, and thank you, Nikki, for your question. Chris, do you mind asking our next question in the Q&A?
Our next question comes from Benjamin Platt. Oregon has set serious goals to reduce emission in our state. Setting aside the reduction of hypothetical pollution, how does permitting anything that can result in an actual increase in emissions support achieving Oregon's goals?
Thanks. Yeah, Christine, do you mind chiming in a little bit? And maybe David could talk a little bit about just a little bit more about how the permit reduces the emissions.
Okay, yeah, I'll just start and I'll refer back to the last answer, which is the way that DEQ's regulatory programs are set up as it relates to right now is that we're responsible for reviewing applications that come into that come to DEQ and make sure that any decisions that we have meet our current regulations. And so the draft permit that we're talking about for Zenith, and that's out for public comment, is done based on Oregon's current regulations. And that's what we have available to make our decisions on as it relates to air emissions.
Yes, and then I'll also chime in, and this is more towards the criteria pollutant aspect. So we're looking at the particulate matters, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide. EPA has established national ambient air quality standards, and that's essentially a concentration of these various pollutants in air that is deemed to be safe for members of the public, including the elderly and children. And in cases where we have new facilities coming in and asking to build their new facilities or make significant modifications that increase emissions, we can require modeling to show that the proposed emissions will not violate any of the existing national ambient air quality standards. In this case, modeling was not required because we're looking at a decrease in emissions from the facility.
All right, thank you. Thank you for your answers. The next hand I have on my screen, we have Samantha Hernandez. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. I had questions around what are the products that Zenith will be handling that have a lower vapor pressure? And also, I had a question about where the public can find the breakdown of the types of products and the quantities handled in the distillate category, which includes renewable diesel.
Yep, so the first part of the question you asked about where to find the vapor pressures. Those are normally available in safety data sheets for the specific compounds. And many other compounds are just, it's more, I don't want to say common knowledge, but if you just do a Google search for, say, renewable diesel vapor pressure, you should be able to get multiple results. As far as looking at what the specific breakdown is of types of fuel, I believe the current annual reports are just pretty basic with distillate. And the proposed permit does require reporting of the various types of fuel received. However, if upon your reading you believe it's too vague, you are always free to submit a comment that you would prefer something more specific. And if that's something that we believe needs to be included, the permit could be revised to have additional specificity on that report. Did I get the full question or did I miss something?
No, those were my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. Thank you, David. Chris, can you write, what's our next question in the Q&A?
Next question comes from Ann Littlewood. What in the public process would potentially cause DEQ to deny the permit?
So I'm not able to give a specific answer, but really if there is a comment that leads DEQ to believe that Zenith cannot comply with the proposed permit, physically impossible, then that would be one reason that the permit may not be approved. And as what happened with the Title V renewal that was derailed back in 2020, 2021, the land use compatibility statement was disapproved. In that case, they just don't have the city's blessing that they're operating properly in the specific zone that they're in. So if the land use compatibility statement was disapproved, DEQ would not be able to approve a permit.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Anne, for your question. Next up, and also I'm going to, just since we're at 7:35, I want to remind everyone that we're taking questions up until 8. And we've got a number of hands raised and more questions in the Q&A. So we might bounce around between folks a bit because I want to make sure that everyone that has a question has an opportunity to ask it. So I'm keeping note of folks that have not asked a question yet, and I want to just make sure that I give them the opportunity to ask their question. So please bear with us as we kind of navigate through what's in the Q&A and raise hands, but we're going to try to get through you all. But I want to make sure that folks that haven't been able to speak or have their question answered yet, we get to them. So with that, Harlan Schober, I am allowing you to unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you. It's having a delay unmuting. Turn your phone on. I'm trying to be sympathetic with the situation you're in. I want to go back to an early question in this session. it was raised that third-party contractors would test for emissions and other operational parameters at Zenith, and that those third-party entities were chosen by Zenith, paid by Zenith, and supervised by Zenith. And, you know, that just screams moral hazard. And you were describing how you could supervise how Zenith managed that or how the third-party contractors did their job. But in a follow the money sense, it just doesn't make sense that Zenith could choose the contractor, pay them, and manage them. So it seems like y'all are really constrained in some bureaucratic framework as to what you can and can't do. But where would the decision be made, if it were to be made, to say, nope, we're going to appoint the contractor, you're going to pay him, and we're going to manage him? I get it, that may be above the pay grade of any of you folks, but where would that kind of decision get made if we were serious about cleaning that particular thing up? And I'd like to hear from you on that. And then I do have one other piece of a question.
Yeah, I would.
Oh, you gotta mute yours.
Okay. Yes. So with regards to where would things need to be changed, that would likely need to be a change in the rules. Currently, the stack testing requirements are in, I believe it's Oregon Administrative Rules 340 Division 212. I think it's between 210 and 214, but I can't remember the exact number. But you do have some concerns. I understand that. However, DEQ does have oversight, and DEQ can choose to reject the test results if any evidence is brought forth that the method was not properly followed, or any of the analytes sent to a laboratory the results have been falsified. So that's one thing that our source test coordinators are really good at, is reviewing the test report and determining were errors made in the method, did they change the results, and if so, were the result changes significant enough to warrant discarding the entire test and requiring the facility to do a complete retest.
Thanks, David. And Harlan, you said you've had maybe like a follow-up. Was that true? Okay. All right. We'll move. Harlan, I'm asking you to unmute yourself just in case you had another one.
I'm
Otherwise
sorry, am I getting through at this point?
You are. We got you.
Okay, volume down.
Yeah, it is.
So I lost my place there with fussing with the mute button. You all had said that you needed to treat all companies on a kind of an even basis. And I think we all are in favor of fairness. My issue here is that I think you probably do that in some other area of DEQ. Well, my complaint, if you will, is that you're too diffident and too soft on these companies. And I agree that you do that universally. My experience with your enforcement around the city of Molala's wastewater treatment plant, it's been equally feckless as your treatment of Zenith. Where would the leverage be found to get DEQ to act with a little more muscle?
Thanks for that, Harlan. What I will say is that it's DEQ's job to enforce Oregon's environmental laws. That's what we're here to do. That's what we do in all of the programs that we have. And all of our laws have specific regulations associated with them for each program. So for the water permitting program, there's specific regulations that we follow to regulate all of the wastewater treatment plants. And that's what we're doing here for the Zenith Air facility. So or the Zenith facility for their air permit, I should say. And so if you have specific questions about what are the laws or what are the regulations, we're happy to point you to anything, but that's what we do day in and day out. And sometimes those regulations change when we have new rules that are approved by the Environmental Quality Commission. And sometimes the laws change when there's new laws that are passed by the Oregon legislature. And then we implement what is new. But that's what we do every day. Is implement Oregon's environmental laws. And I appreciate your concern about how we do that. And I hear that, but I just want to make sure that you know that's why we do what we do, is that we're following the laws and regulations that exist and that we have available to us.
Great, thanks, Christine. Thanks, Harlan. Let's see, now next up is a chat or question in the Q&A. Chris, feel free to read our next question.
The next question comes from Margaret Butler. You explained that the permit covers stationary sources only, not mobile, but Zenith is proposing a massive increase in truck and train and marine traffic. Zenith's liability is limited to incidents that occur on site, a very small percentage of the area that is placed at risk. What is Zenith doing to ensure that communities along the transportation corridor and ecosystem are protected from this increased threat that Zenith is proposing?
Oh, yeah, this is a question specific about Zenith's operations. And that's something we do have some people from Zenith here, if they're able to answer that question. Michael and Chris, I'm not sure how we're able to work with Zenith staff that may be online if they believe they can't answer the question.
Actually this might have to be something that's responded to in writing. Let me see 1 second. I see somebody that has a raised hand.
I think JT has a hand raised. Had a hand raised.
Okay. 1 second. Let me my bearings straight here. Okay, JT, you are allowed to unmute yourself.
Thank you for the question. I will do my best to answer it. There's a lot there. First of all, Zenith, we operate within all of our permit requirements. All of our spill response requirements. We're regulated by multiple agencies, and we strive to operate in a safe and proper manner and focus on maintaining a safe facility that's prepared for the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me see, I'm reviewing this question again. Okay. So I'm gonna go to our next raised hand. I've got Jan Zuckerman. You're welcome to ask your question.
Great. Hi, thank you. I actually have a couple questions. I wanted to follow up on Nikki's question earlier about when you're assessing penalties on noncompliance on Zenith, you look at economics, and I'm wondering what about the health and safety and economic impact on the community when you're assessing penalties on noncompliance with Zenith? That's my first question, and then I have one more. So maybe I'll wait and let you answer that one first.
Sure.
Yeah, I can answer that one. Yeah, the economic benefit is just a piece of the penalty calculation, but we have other pieces that look at environmental and human health impact, the way we classify the violation, and then there's a penalty factor called magnitude. So those things will contribute to the size of the penalty. And some of that's actually codified, like a, plant site emission limit violation is a specific classification, that sort of thing. And then it also helps dictate, as I explained before, our enforcement response. And so for air quality, it tends to be a larger response when it's more emissions or triggers bigger regulatory thresholds, because those are associated with greater human health impacts. But we're really looking at the violation that we're citing in the enforcement. So if we were looking at plant site emission limit violation, we'd be looking at what's the impact of that violation, not what's the impact of the facility as a whole, if that makes sense.
Okay. Okay, got that. Thinking about the impact of the facility, what are the plans in place to clean up blended fuels that may require multiple methods of cleanup in the case of spills on land and water, which also impact air quality?
Okay, I think that's for one of our other experts.
Yeah, so I'm Scott Smith in the DEQ's emergency response program. So we do multiple types of drills and exercises to prepare for all scenarios. Sometimes they do a land spill, sometimes they do a water spill, and sometimes it's both. And so, and in real life, of course, we're out there working on not just fuel facilities like these, but train derailments and ships that sink and, tanker truck rollovers and things like that. We field somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 calls per year. So we have significant experience in various types of cleanup all over the state. So, given, your question didn't really define like what was spilled and exactly where, but we do have techniques, equipment, and the response capabilities to respond to multiple things. And if it's really big, then we open the door for the federal government to start bringing in, their response teams. The company itself would be required to hire more and more contractors until we had enough equipment and experience on site to clean it up. Simultaneously, we'd be conducting community air monitoring and issuing advisories if necessary for shelter in place or evacuations or things like that if we get to the levels that would require that. So, we practice this on a continual basis through our drill program, and we do it daily out in the field every day.
Okay, great. I have another question that's in the chat, and I don't know if it's fair for me to ask that one right now too, or do you want to go to someone else?
Well, I mean, while you're at it, I see your question about enforcing compliance.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go for it.
Okay, so is DEQ's position that the responsibility of enforcing compliance with the agreed upon renewable fuels between the city and Zenith, and the city, is there any precedent for this? If so, has the city demonstrated willingness to do this?
So we do have one condition right now in the draft air contaminant discharge permit that does reference that new pipes must be for renewable fuels and non-fuel products only. Now, the idea of a LUX containing additional conditions that sources want or need incorporated into an air permit is something new, so there really is not a precedent for such a detailed LUX like this.
And so what does that mean?
But
Jan, I can jump in here. I think we can't comment on what the city will or will not force. That's in their jurisdiction and that's their job. But what we can comment on is how we'll enforce this ACDP permit once it's final. And so there are some conditions that Zenith requested in its ACDP permit, and it needed to request those to be consistent with the Lux. So there's, as David mentioned, a condition on new equipment and piping and connections. And then there's also a condition that they have to cease storing and handling crude oil in 2027. And so those are going to be in the permit, and those are conditions that DEQ can enforce. But anything outside the permit that's in the Lux would be enforced by the city, and I can't really comment on like
Okay,
precedent
so a
or
new
how they
city,
do their
so a new
enforcement
city
work.
government would need to be enforcing that.
If it's not in the air, like we'll enforce what's in the air permit. Anything else, you would have to ask the city about their enforcement process.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jan. Thank you, Becca and David. Okay, let's get to our next question. Chris, do you mind going ahead?
Next question is from Laureen Shear. Do you talk with workers and their union reps, if they have a union, when making an inspection?
Every inspection is going to be different. The last time I was at Zenith was with the EPA, and I believe we talked with production manager, and then I think there were 3 other people, so a total of 4 people that I had talked to with various roles throughout the facility. Again, it really depends on the facility and the inspection. There's some inspections where I only talk to one person because there's only one person there. And other cases, each different process may have a different operator that I talk to get a better idea of what goes on and how they do their job at their specific location. So again, each one's different. And yes, we do try and talk to as many people as we can that actually operate some of the equipment so we can get a better idea of what exactly goes on the ground.
All right, thanks for that, David. And let's see, I see JT has your hand up again. Is there something that you wanted to chime in on with this question, JT?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I just wanted to introduce myself properly. This is JT Hendricks. I'm the terminal manager for Zenith here in Portland. So just want to make sure everybody got that the first time. I'm not sure if they heard me. Appreciate it.
Okay, yep. Thanks for that. Okay, I'm gonna move to our next raised hand. Let's see, Michael Mitz. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. So, excuse me. I started eating dinner because it's been about an hour. Apologies. Let me find my question. Okay, so referring to early on in the conversation, in the presentation, tagging on to what Nancy Heiser said about the AP 42 permit. Something that really stood out to me, like why was the asphalt refinery emission units removed from the air quality permit? That's something that came up early in this presentation that didn't make any sense to me. Can one of you explain that to me, please?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the land use compatibility statement required Zenith to apply for a permit only for the terminal operation. So that would be the transloading activities, receiving liquid products, storing, and shipping offsite. Without the emission units for the asphalt plant in the ACDP, if the decision is made to issue the ACDP, Zenith would not have authority to operate those units. And once the ACDP is issued and in full effect, the Lux requires Zenith to request termination of the Title V permit, which will completely remove the authority to operate any of those emission units. So any operations would have to be brought in as if there was a new facility coming in.
Well, I appreciate your answer and I thank you for your time. I honestly don't understand what you just said.
So let's see. Let me see if I can think of a.
Why was the asphalt refinery emission units removed from the air quality permit? That's what I.
Yep, because the air quality permit, this ACDP, is going to be in time the one permit for Zenith for air quality. The current permit allows all those units for the asphalt refinery to be operated, but the ACDP will say, nope, these are not going to be authorized units. You cannot operate them once you're operating solely under this air permit that is currently proposed right now.
So are you saying that it's the asphalt refinery emissions are grandfathered in? Is that?
No, nope. They're going to lose the ability to utilize those units. Essentially, they're giving up the ability to utilize those units, and they'll have to be completely unhooked or removed from site.
I see. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate your question. Chris, do you can you read us our next one in the Q&A?
Yes. Next question is from Jim Plunkett. I'm surprised to hear that EPA conducts their inspections with a FLIR camera, but DEQ does not, especially since FLIR is an Oregon company. Isn't it just a Isn't it just a visualization tool critical at Zenith's complex and aging facility?
Yes, EPA does have several FLIR cameras that they utilize. DEQ at this point in time, we do not have any FLIR cameras to use. Essentially, they allow for a special type of imaging that utilizes not the visible light spectrum, but a different spectrum. So when you look through the camera, you can actually see plumes of VOC. While extremely helpful in doing some of the inspections, they don't show a guaranteed violation. At this point in time, they're great for qualitative use. You can say, hey, I see something, I think something may be wrong based on what I'm seeing. But it won't tell you how much is actually coming out from the facility. But yep, I did talk to EPA when I was in inspection with them, and they said, yep, without a FLIR camera, you're really looking to see if you notice anything that seems off, or you're doing records reviews, and you happen to see that something inappropriate is put into a tank, or that specific maintenance requirements may not have been done. So it does make it a little more difficult, but DEQ still is able to do compliance inspections without the use of the FLIR cameras.
Hey, thanks, David. And I'm going to call on our next raised hand. I've got Kathy Spofford. Unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, you wanted me to read the question? Can you hear me?
Yes, you are up to
Okay.
ask your question. Thank you.
So, as you know, Zenith is a fossil fuel company, and now it's added renewables to its operation. And this is really not a transition, it's an addition. So how can DEQ close the loophole of fossil fuel companies adding what they call renewables in order to obtain permits just to expand their operations?
Yeah, and this really goes back to what Christine had mentioned, in that we receive an application, we look at what are the current environmental regulations and laws in place. And, at this point in time, there isn't anything prohibiting some of the activities being done. But I believe Christine is unable to continue talking. She had a prior commitment. But yes, if you do have further questions on that, we can provide a more detailed response in writing later on.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Chris, can you read our next question, please?
The next question comes in from an anonymous attendee. Zenith's transition to fuels, which are said to be renewable, requires highly non-renewable fracked gas in the refining process. How does DEQ reconcile Zenith's claims of renewable fuel with the reality that the production of fracked gas causes extensive greenhouse gas emissions? Fracked gas or methane is needed for extracting hydrogen, which is needed in the renewable fuel refining process.
Yes, so as one of the first slides I had mentioned, that any type of activity that is not done on the regulated stationary source, it's not accounted for in DEQ's analysis. So in this case, we are looking at what happens to produce these things that are being received by Zenith. And in addition, with regards to the renewable, the term renewable fuel with regards to what is and is not allowed in some of the newer piping components is based on the definition in the Portland City Code.
All right, thank you for that. All right, I'm going to call on, let's see, I'm looking for somebody that hasn't asked a question yet. And y'all, we're almost at 8:05. We're gonna stay on a little bit longer to try to get through as many of these questions as possible. So right now we're going to prioritize questions from folks that have not had the opportunity to have their questions answered yet. But I'm gonna really try to go through these quickly, but thoroughly as well. So next up, I have Catherine Bax. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, hi. I just have a quick question about your decision-making process. So the last day for submitting comments is December 16th. How long typically after that would DEQ be making its final decision on the air quality permit?
Yeah, it depends. I have seen sometimes where, within 2 weeks, we're able to respond to all the comments. And in other cases, we have a very controversial facility, and it may be 3 or 4 months for us to fully address the comments and potentially make any edits to the permit based on any comments that we receive. So a good guess is between 1 and 3 months. But until we see the volume and substance of the comments, it's really hard to pin an exact timeline.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, David. I just wanted to pull up this question. Sorry to skip ahead a little bit, Chris, but we were just talking about the FLIR cameras, or FLIR. The question was asking why we are not using that. David, I think you probably already answered that question, but even if you did, do you mind just chiming in a little bit there?
Yeah, in short, we do not have a FLIR camera. Some of the two main issues I'm aware of that are barriers to obtaining one. One of them is cost. I believe some of these are $400,000+ a piece. Very breakable equipment, so we do need to be careful. And the second is training and certification. It's more complicated than just taking a phone or an old school camera where you can just turn it on, point and click. It does have a unique operating system, and you do have to operate it a certain way because I believe a lot of the battery charge goes into an air conditioner or a cooling unit on the camera that has to cool it down to a temperature well below what we would normally find in the ambient. So those are two reasons I'm aware of, but yeah, I mean, there's always a possibility that we may have this technology in the future.
Great. Thanks, David. Appreciate that. And yeah, sorry to jump ahead, Chris, but feel free to read our next question in the Q&A.
Okay, a question from Story Schwantes. If DEQ is only evaluating if the source can follow the permit, what is the public comment period for?
Yep. So the public comment period, we want to know what the public believes. And in many cases, the comments provided by the public have shaped how a final permit is written. In several permitting processes I've been working with, there have been some significant changes that have occurred to draft permits specifically based on the comments that we have received from the public.
Great, thank you for that. And let's see. Let's see. I've got another question in the chat. I'm bouncing between me and Chris now. Sorry, y'all, but there's one question from an anonymous attendee that I see about the last information session saying that DEQ committed to sharing a breakdown of the types and quantities of products in the distillate category. David, do you mind sharing a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sharing a breakdown of types and quantities of products in the distillate category. I can tell you that the distillate category generally would refer to conventional diesel or ultra low sulfur diesel, biodiesel, renewable diesel, and some types of jet fuel that are similar to a jet kerosene. I will have to look to see specifically what we did commit to and what type of breakdown we were looking at. But unfortunately, I cannot recall the specifics of this at this time.
Great, thank you. See, Chris, sorry, I jumped ahead with you on the Q&A, but feel free to find a question from somebody that we haven't heard from yet.
We have a question from Sarah Taylor. Do air quality standards differ if the site is in close proximity to homes and schools and other public spaces? If so, what are the considerations related to human activity? Do you regulate air quality from oil trains?
Thanks. JR, do you mind chiming in? And then, yeah, then maybe David could chime in as well.
Hey, yeah, thanks. It's a good question. There are different, so for our program, for the Clean Air Oregon program, we do have specific standards related to the emissions of toxic air contaminants that vary by the location where people might breathe them in or be exposed to them. And in our program, residential exposure locations or houses are the most sort of restrictive places where we make assumptions of someone's been living there for 70 years, breathing it every day for 24 hours a day. Then we have other categories like non-residential child, which is assumptions of school. So I believe it's 12 years and 8 hours a day. There's also some different assumptions that go into maybe how much soil they eat at different ages and stuff like that. And then we have non-residential worker exposure locations. So we do vary the risk that people, the risk at those different locations based on what people are breathing. and then we regulate to whatever the highest risk is. So if it's a house that's closest, which is usually the highest, or if it's a school that's closer, or if it's a business that's closer, our program takes the highest risk into account. It's quite different than the air quality permit that's being issued here, or that is being discussed, where we're looking at national ambient air quality standards for criteria pollutants. So yes, I'll stop there and maybe someone can answer the second part of that question.
So as soon as Zoom cooperates with me, yes, with ambient air quality standards, we look at ambient air, and that is defined really as anything outside of the facility boundaries. And the facility boundary, there's some additional definitions where there can't be public access or there's something preventing it. And all ambient air is treated the same. However, the ambient air quality standards, they do take into account the fact that some people may have lung difficulties or immunocompromised or children. So those are recognized when EPA does set the standard. And JR, we did have a very similar question if you wanted to chime in about why Zenith is in group
Actually,
3.
David,
Oh,
can I
sorry.
ask you, the very end of the question is, do you
Sorry.
regulate air quality from oil trains? I don't think we got to that piece yet.
No, we do not. DEQ does have a high-speed rail program, I believe it's called, that
High hazard rail.
have high hazard rail. Okay. But yes, the trains carrying any type of commodity are considered mobile sources. We do not look at them as part of a stationary source permitting activity.
Thanks. And I think you guys were about to ask the question about the Zenith being grouped in group 3 in the Cleaner Air Oregon program.
Yes, yeah, thank you. So the reason it's in group 3 is essentially there was a couple of reasons. One was the primary driver is the types and quantities of toxic air contaminant emissions for this facility, and the levels of sort of screened risk that would have. And then the proximity to the homes. As I was mentioning, the residences are typically the most restrictive for those exposure levels. And the homes that are closest to this facility where we would be seeing those releases are about 580 meters away, which doesn't sound far, but it from the way that emissions leave the facility and the wind moves and it disperses, by the time someone gets out, to that range, we start to see quite a bit of reduction in the exposures at the ground level. The plumes have dispersed. And then the other piece of this is that a lot of these emissions are similar to, gas emissions. So BTEX, benzene, toluene, ethyl benzene, and xylenes, which are all kind of similar aromatic compounds. They do have negative health effects, cancer and non-cancer, but the levels at which people need to be exposed to those to get similar health risks to other types of emissions are much higher. So right now we've prioritized facilities that have different types of emissions that are closer to homes and other sensitive receptors in those communities. And that would be emissions of things like heavy metals, particulate matter that's coming out, PCBs, dioxins and furans, some of these more persistent and toxic chemicals. So that is why currently it's down in groups 3. As David mentioned, if we do get a triennial air toxics emissions inventory from all the facilities in the state, so that we can continue to review and make sure nobody's made any major changes. So we'll keep getting information. And if we get any other new information that gives us concern, we can absolutely call that facility in sooner.
Thanks, JR. I'm going to call on a hand here. So I saw he had a question in the chat as well. So, Pat, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you for unmuting me. So I had several questions, but my primary one is concern the ongoing obfuscation of Zenith entry into a business entity in Oregon. It seemed to me in your presentation that you described them as an asphalt company. They are not an asphalt company. What they did is rather under the radar acquired an asphalt company that already was in operation in Oregon and was shutting down. And they used that opportunity to expand to a fossil fuel transport company that is now moving huge of fossil fuels through Portland, Oregon, and out into other communities in the United States. And I am annoyed that you would recognize them as an asphalt company. So that is one thing that I am concerned about that you have put out in this public hearing, because my understanding is they are not an asphalt company. The other thing I am concerned about, and perhaps that you could recognize during this meeting, is that their original permit was extremely expansive. So that the one that they are now applying for is much more in line with the kinds of emissions that they actually produce. So even though it makes them look like good guys from reducing the request for their permit allowance, it is in fact much more in line with what they have produced in the past and probably will produce in the future. And so it is unlikely they will exceed those limits. And it is unlikely there will be an opportunity for Portland residents to address any kind of increase because their original permit was so high. So perhaps you could explain some of these discrepancies for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Let Becca chime in, and then if anybody else on our team wants to follow up, please do.
Yeah, thanks for the question and the comment, Pat. I can address the first piece. I agree with you. It's not an asphalt company. It is a company that purchased an asphalt plant. And so maybe there was just a misunderstanding of language there. They purchased a facility that included an asphalt plant and transloading, docks and pipes and things like that and tanks. The change in how the facility was used was recognized by DEQ when we started to renew their Title V air quality permit a number of years ago. And that's why DEQ requested to the city of Portland or for Zenith to apply for a new Lux, specifically because of that change that you've noted. And so the ultimate outcome of that was the Lux issued by the city of Portland in October 2022. So I guess I just wanted to let you know that we agree that there was a change in the way the facility was being used, and that's why we asked for that new land use statement.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that explanation. However, if you will look back to your recording of this meeting, that was definitely not clear to anyone new to this controversy. So I would have you recognize in the future that Zenith is not an asphalt company and that they used rather peculiar situation to acquire a property in Portland and then expand it into a fossil fuel transport organization. Thank you.
Thank you. David, do you have something to add to that?
Yes. So the second part of your question, you had comments regarding, the actual emissions from the facility versus what is permitted. So the permitting program that was essentially put together by EPA and adopted by states, and states have been making some modifications themselves. It's all comes down to what is the potential to emit and PTE. So we're looking in a way to say, how can we treat all facilities the same? We look at what is their maximum amount of emissions as if they were operating 24/7, 365 days a year. We tend to use the term 8760 or 8,760 hours per year. When this facility was initially permitted, I believe back in the 90s, the emission calculations done and looking at historic emissions that occurred in the 70s, it was determined that a plant site emission limit for VOC closer to 189 tons per year was the appropriate level. Again, that is what the maximum amount was. That's what they were permitted at. Now, coming into this change, we're looking at putting a limit of 39 tons per year. Again, that reduces the maximum amount of emissions. However, anytime there is a maximum amount in the permit, a facility based on their actual operations has flexibility to change their production or change their throughput as long as they stay within the proposed limit.
Great. Thank you for that. However, again, I would say, please let the public understand that their initial permit was hugely beyond what they actually produce in emissions. And so the idea that they may exceed the emissions limits that you are now requiring is highly unlikely, and that because the initial permit was exceeding what they actually produced, it does not make them a good citizen or anything to that effect. They simply were taking advantage of a hugely voluntary opportunity to emit as much as they wanted, and now understanding that they have limited requirements for admission, they are reducing that request. It is not based on any goodwill on the company's part. Thank you.
Thank you for your question and for any input like that. Things that are more so that are a comment for our evaluation, please provide that comment either in writing or at one of our public hearings, either in November or December. We're going to take just one or two more questions here because we're coming up at 8:30 and a lot of our folks need to sign off for the night. They're taking care of families and such and responsibilities at home. So I definitely want to be respectful of their time. And I appreciate everybody being here and staying on for this extra half hour. So Chris, can you read our next question?
The next question comes from an anonymous attendee. More questions for Zenith. What evidence do you have that the market will support this proposal? Is renewable naphtha going to be transported by train? If so, what increased risks are there given its volatility? What is Zenith's insurance for a single tank event?
All right. Thanks for that. JT, is that something that you would like to answer?
Absolutely. Can you hear me?
We can.
All right, thanks. Yeah, so to talk about the renewables a little bit, Zenith's committed to phase out crude oil and replace it with renewable fuels. While Zenith's primary focus is renewable diesel, renewable naphtha is one type of renewable fuel. That was in our air permit application for calculations to comply with the requirement. So again, Zenith has no plans to store to handle large quantities of renewable naphtha, but as Oregon looks to decrease the carbon emission associated with gasoline usage, demand for renewable naphtha may increase. So, and then to the second part, I think you asked something about insurance. We do have pollution liability insurance and also an insurance obligation in our franchise agreement with the city. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, I'm going to try to surmise a few of these questions that were kind of enforcement and compliance related. And then we're going to have to wrap up after this. And I apologize for the folks that we didn't get to. I'm going to jot down the questions that were not answered and would be happy for us to answer these in writing. So there were a few questions that were let's see, some about the McCall doc, like one being what was let's see, according yeah, do we have the authority to emit the McCall doc? What about financial penalties about the economic benefits from using the McCall doc? And how many violations in general does it take for us to revoke a permit? Or can we write something into a permit saying, you know, X amount of violations and you're out? So it kind of, these are coupled as questions about asking about what was the penalty for use of the McCall doc and how many concerns about repeated violations and what would be the serious consequences if those continued.
Sure. I'll just go back to my previous answer about the McCall doc. Consistent with our enforcement guidance and our policy of how we treat these types of violation, we did not issue a penalty. So we just don't get into the evaluation of economic benefit, but we would if we did have a violation where we were assessing a penalty. And then the second question, I think at what point do you get enough violations to revoke a permit? I have not seen that in my 8 years at DEQ. I think we have the authority, but we take a number of steps, as I mentioned before, that are usually result in getting a facility back into compliance. Most facilities, as soon as they get a warning letter from us, they're responsive and wanting to come back into compliance. And if we don't get that, we ratchet up and we can pursue civil judicial enforcement. Occasionally we refer matters if we're not getting a response to our parallel criminal partners, and do other things. And I think in theory we could revoke a permit, but I think it's a very fact specific type of situation for that.
All right. Thank you, Becca. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody, for hanging on. Later, we're going to wrap up the questions and answers now. You can see in the chat here that if you have your hand raised and still have a question, send them to the email there and put Zenith information meeting question in the subject line, and we'll get back to you. We also took down the several questions that were still in the Q&A box here. And we're going to answer those in writing. If you joined here on the Zoom app on your phone or your computer, I should be getting your email address following the conclusion of this meeting, and we'll be able to email that to you as well. And I will also email you when we upload these presentation slides as well as this recording. When it comes to this recording, it might take a few days for us to get that through because we use a transcription service to ensure accuracy and accessibility. But do know that that will be coming shortly, and I will be emailing you all with that information and how you can find it. And I'll be emailing that to anybody that is signed up to our GovDelivery email list. So with that said, I'm going to pass the mic to Lisa Ball, who's going to provide our closing remarks and an overview of our next steps. Again, thank you very much, everybody, for your input and your questions. We appreciate your participation.
I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening and for your questions. We'd like to wrap up with a brief summary of the next things to come up for Zenith. The public comment period is open now through December 16th. There are 2 upcoming public hearings scheduled. The first one is Tuesday, November 19th from 7 to 9 p.m. This is a hybrid hearing where folks can attend in person at the University of Portland Buckley Center Auditorium or online via Zoom. The second is on Wednesday, December 4th from 6 to 8 p.m., which is a virtual hearing hosted on Zoom. DEQ may revise the draft air quality permit based on any comments that are received. DEQ evaluates verbal and written comments with equal weight. If you'd like to learn more and receive email updates about the permitting action for Zenith, please sign up for the GovDelivery subscription that is linked in the chat. We appreciate everyone's time and energy here tonight. If you have any general questions about Zenith, please direct them to Michael Locke, who is putting his contact information in the chat now. And I want to thank everyone again for attending and for your questions, and have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.